Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of our second season. On today's episode, we're going to be covering Daredevil Parts of a Whole. That is the first appearance of Maya Lopez, aka Echo. This is pretty soon after the Echo show premiered on Disney Plus, so we cover this now. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Cultured Pull List, part of the Cultured Nerd Podcast Network. Now, like I just said a second ago, the Echo series just came out, I think it was like a week and a half ago at this point, January 9th. All 5 episodes dropped at once, but this is Maya Lopez's second appearance in the MCU. Her first was in Hawkeye, but I kind of wanted to break down or just cover, her first appearance in the comics, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the differences between the MCU version and the comic version, and talk about the comic. Before we go forward, I don't really have a whole lot of comic news to talk about. The only thing I really wanted to mention, and I don't really see that many people talking about it, probably because it's comics and people die and come back all the time. But
Mhm.
it's like in the Titans Beast World arc that's going on in DC right now. In the last issue, Beast Boy was seemingly killed,
Mm.
which I'm not really sure where they're gonna go with it. If I'm sure they're probably not gonna keep him dead, but
Right.
at the same time, it was a little surprising. I wasn't expecting it. Which, by the way, like Amanda Waller is the worst. Like she has like moments in the comics where you're like, oh, she's almost kind of an anti-hero, more like eh. But like
Mhm.
in Beast World, she sucks. Like
Yeah.
she literally orchestrates the whole like Beast World thing. Like she basically puts the whole world in jeopardy just to get the general public to be like, oh, superheroes kind of suck. Like that's literally her only. And then like to fix it, she sends some guy with like teleportation powers in. No. I forget what his powers are. They're like he like explodes energy or something like that, and she
Yeah.
teleports him inside of Garfield, Beast Boy, who had to basically become Starro to stop another like Star Conqueror. And that's what started this whole. Oh, and yeah, and then she used Doctor Hate to manipulate Garfield into taking over the world, basically. And then she sends this dude in to his death, like teleports him inside of Beast Boy, and then causes him to explode. And that's like how the fourth issue ended.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think issue 5 comes out later this month. I think 5 and 6 are both coming out this month. I think Beast World
Yes.
is ending this month.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, but I that was kind of a surprising end panel, though I doubt it's going to.
Mhm.
I doubt he's going to stay dead, and I am curious to see how they bring him back. If they do.
Yeah. Just going off of that, I think that it's kind of been happening for a while, but it's just sort of kicking into gear this year. Is I think that
Hmm.
they're kind of setting up Amanda Waller to be the next
Yeah,
big bad in the DCU. So it'll
yeah.
be interesting to see where that goes.
I definitely feel that because yeah, she's kind of the bad guy in Titans this crossover,
Mm.
and she's even had quite a few appearances in the Green Arrow series.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's definitely setting up. It's not really a Suicide Squad. It's more just like a bunch of like her own like. It's almost like her own version of like the Injustice League or like Legion of Doom more than the Suicide Squad. And there's that new character, Doctor Hate, who we still
Yeah.
don't know a whole lot about. Um, but yeah,
Mhm.
been interesting. But yeah, let's get into Echo. So,
Yeah.
well, technically, Daredevil parts of a whole. It covers issues 9 through 15
Mm.
of the Daredevil like 1999 run that like ran through the early 2000s. I think most, if not all, of the issues were written by David Mack. I think most, not, but yeah. But yeah, so Daredevil parts of a whole was written by David Mack with Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti. It, now, I think Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti wrote issue 12,
Mm.
but David Mack wrote the others. The art is by Joe Quesada with David Ross and Rob Haynes. Inkers are Jamie Palmiotti and Mark Morales. The colorists are Richard Eisenov with David Self. And then the letterers, the lettering is done by RS and Comic Crafts Liz Agrafiotis, Troy Pateri, and Oscar Gongora. And these issues surprisingly were released kind of far apart. It seems like they took some gaps because there's only like what 9 through 15. There's like 6 issues, 7 issues, and they were released released between May 1999 and
Mhm.
February 2001. So that's like a year and a half that
Yeah.
it took them to release all these. But yeah, let's get into a brief summary of this. Okay, so this first issue starts out showing Matt Murdock playing his piano. Um, at this point, his office is doubling as his home, and so
Mhm.
this piano was in his home, and he received a inheritance from Karen Page, who died recently. Um, so that's how he was able to buy this like home slash office. But basically, there's just kind of a narration. It's basically just showing Matt kind of grieving over the loss of Karen, and Black Widow, his ex, shows up and kind of comforts him a little bit. But we also see a parallel to this new character that gets introduced, Maya Lopez, and she is also playing the piano, but she is deaf. She's able to sense the vibrations in the piano to play, but also she has the ability to pretty much copy anything she sees. So this allows her to not only copy people's movements to play instruments, but she can read people's lips and copy speech perfectly. So that's how she's able to talk while she's deaf. And and she's been deaf her entire life. She was born deaf, but it also makes her very adept at fighting, as she can just copy anybody's. All she has to do is watch somebody fight, and she can um, copy those moves perfectly.
Mhm.
And we do see that a little later. We see her in a professional fight, but um, we also learn that her father was business partners with Wilson Fisk, and yeah, her father was killed when she was very young, and Wilson Fisk, aka Kingpin, took care of her since she was a kid and sent her to like a special school for people with disabilities and things like that. Just really took care of her, and we then go back to Matt, who's at his office with Foggy Nelson, his partner, and they are talking to a client, a man named Lenny, I believe, and Lenny says that he is or was the custodian for one of Wilson Fisk's businesses or his home or something. But as they're talking to this guy who he has a speech impediment, whenever he gets nervous, he like can't talk properly. But as they're talking to Lenny, a sniper across the street on a building across the street shoots and kills Lenny and grazes Matt's face. And while this is going on, Maya is at a professional fight, and Kingpin's in the audience. Um, she does a lot of performing. Like she does piano recitals. She is obviously a fighter, and she also does some ballet and other dances. But right after Matt recovers, he puts on his Daredevil suit and hunts down the sniper. Turns out to be these two twins. One of them is in the midst of calling Wilson Fisk while Daredevil stops him and apprehends him, and uh, Daredevil picks up the phone after stopping them and basically threatens Fisk, saying that he'll take him to court. And in retaliation and in response to this, Fisk sends Maya to go talk to Matt and kind of get close to him. And at this point, Maya doesn't know anything about Wilson Fisk's criminal enterprises. She just kind of thinks he's a businessman and, her uncle slash father figure. But right after this happens, Matt runs back to his practice and changes back into his clothes. So when the paramedics show up, they take him to the hospital to get his wound checked out. And while he's there, he thinks he sees Lenny, but he feels like it must have been a hallucination or something because Lenny died right in front of him. The next day, Matt wakes up and he comes down to his practice to find that Maya is there and wants to talk to him. And apparently, she was told by Wilson Fisk that Matt is trying to investigate him, for criminal dealings, but he tells Maya that he's innocent and wants Maya to try and convince Matt otherwise. But as she goes further into their practice, she sees um, the crime scene, the blood spatter. She sees the destroyed piano, and she gives Matt her information and says for him to meet her for coffee the next day. So that night, Matt breaks into Kingpin's home, takes out all the guards, and he breaks into his safe where Matt finds a bunch of incriminating evidence on a bunch of high level officials and politicians and um, army officers, people like that Wilson Fisk has dirt on and is blackmailing. Um, and in response to this, which Kingpin isn't very happy, and he knows that it's Daredevil that did it. He tells Maya that Daredevil is the one that killed Maya's father, and the proof he shows her is a picture of Daredevil with the gun that killed her father. Apparently, Fisk had it in his safe, and Daredevil left it in the safe, but he still picked it up, so it got picked up on the security cameras. So, with this new information, Maya has this dance recital coming up, but instead of doing the ballet that she was supposed to do, she does this kind of interpretive dance that recounts this ancient legend that's part of her Cheyenne ancestry. And meanwhile, we see Wilson Fisk, who is remembering the night that he killed Maya's father. Next, we see Maya training, and she is watching a video that Fisk gave her of Daredevil and Kingpin fighting, so she can copy their fighting styles and fighting moves. We then cut back to Matt and Foggy. They're at their practice. The crime scene in their office is being cleaned up, and Foggy reveals to Matt that the client that got murdered, Lenny, actually had a brother, Larry, twin brother, but Larry is um, the guy who saw Matt in the hospital. So I think I think the brother that was actually the custodian survived,
Yeah.
and the twin that you know didn't really know anything about Fisk but knew his brother was afraid of him went to Matt and Foggy for help, and
Yeah.
he got
Yeah.
killed. And they were thinking, so I kind of get the names mixed up because it's like Lenny and
Yeah.
Larry, but I guess Larry is the original, the brother who actually worked for Fisk, and he's the surviving brother. So after this reveal, one of the cleanup crime scene cleanup guys calls Fisk and tells him this information that he overheard about the twin brothers and that they killed the wrong brother. But after this, Matt goes and meets Maya for coffee, and they end up really hitting it off. And they end up like pretty much just spending the whole day together, having lunch and walking in the park, going to the movies. And there's obviously a romantic
Hmm.
connection between them. And at one point, Matt and Maya like they start laughing together, but this opens Matt's stitches, and his blood kind of makes like I guess a question mark pattern that Maya notices as she wipes it off his face.
Hmm.
But after their date, they both go home. Maya prepares to enact her revenge, while Daredevil just kind of goes off and does Daredevil-y things. And while he's out patrolling, Maya shows up and starts attacking him. He immediately recognizes her by her scent and her sound and everything. But she starts using moves from Bullseye as well as himself. She has billy clubs that she uses just like him. So they fight briefly, but he's trying not to hurt her, but she's actively trying to kill him with the gun that Fisk used to kill her father. And during this fight, there like the issue between 11 and 13, issue 12, takes place during their fight, but it's a bit of like a one-off because it kind of
Hmm. Yeah.
tells the story of a bunch of different people that overlap. But it
Hmm.
is pretty interesting. Um,
Yeah.
so we're introduced to Barbara and Eddie, and Eddie is a cop, but ever since his partner was murdered, he's been in a comatose state, and Barbara that's like can't keep living like that anymore. He just won't talk to her at all as a psychological thing, and she's kind of working up the nerve to tell him that she's leaving him. And then we see this guy Bobby. He is a convicted rapist. He raped this 14-year-old girl, and he's done a bunch of other messed up stuff. He's like into drugs and all these other criminal things. But he was put in prison by Daredevil and testimony by the girl he assaulted. But he was supposed to be in jail for 15 years, but he got out in 5 to be a model by being a model prisoner. And now he's breaking his parole and going after Chloe, the girl that he assaulted originally, that he blames for being put in prison.
Mhm.
And while this is going on, Echo and Daredevil are fighting over the rooftops, and he's kind of caught in the middle of this. Bobby is, and he ends up being knocked off the roof onto this guy's car. Now, this guy is John, and 3 years ago he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and he was fired from his job because the disease is gonna cause him to have tremors, and he worked at an auto shop and they can't really have him working there, and now he doesn't have money to pay the bills, and he's afraid, and he doesn't have money to um, pay for his medication either, his treatment, and he's afraid of how how everyone's going to perceive him once he starts to decline. Plus he can't provide for his family, so he's actively thinking of he's thinking of killing himself as Bobby lands on his car roof, and he just so happens to see a newspaper that says that there is a warrant or a $200 reward out for a cop killer, and it seems
Mhm.
like Bobby is the one who killed Eddie's partner, and
Um,
John sees the reward and he's like, "Oh well, all my problems are solved now. I got to turn this guy in."
mhm.
And then we're introduced to Andy. He's a kid who lives in the bad part of, well, I was gonna say the bad part of Hell's Kitchen, but that's kind of all of Hell's Kitchen. But I guess
Right.
the extra bad part. But apparently, he and a lot of the other neighborhood kids had this mentor named Mr. Kelly, but I guess Mr. Kelly hasn't been around lately. And while Andy's trying to stay out of trouble, the rest of the kids in the neighborhood are kind of getting into bad stuff. And one of them starts to threaten Andy, but as he's doing so, they see the fight going on between Daredevil and Echo, and it causes them to rush over and watch. And we also see John and Bobby right there. This like all this is happening like right near this building, and then the fight also snaps Eddie out of his comatose state, and he's Mr. Kelly, the guy that was
Mhm.
helping the neighborhood kids. And as he looks out his window, he sees Andy, and it kind of snaps him out of his state. And so he and Barbara are happy, and so is Andy that Mr. Kelly seems he's gonna be back to his old self, and John is also happy that he caught this guy and he's gonna get $200,000.
Mhm.
And yeah, that's pretty much where this wraps up. But it's kind of an interesting way to bring all these different people together into like the same moment.
This picks up right where issue 11 ended up. Technically, 12 it did as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with she has Echo has Daredevil pinned down, gun to his head, but then all the people start showing up, and she basically decides that like she doesn't want to like scar these kids, so she just kind of runs away and leaves them there. Um, the next day, because with the cell phone, they're able to get Wilson Fisk into prison. I'm sorry, into court, not prison. Um, and
Right.
and then because they have Larry and Foggy's going to represent Larry,
Mm-hmm.
but Foggy's mom is representing Wilson Fisk,
Yeah.
and but then because Larry is like Foggy's key witness,
Mm-hmm.
and but he's missing, so Daredevil's looking for Larry. Um, Wilson, Foggy's mother is representing Wilson, and kind of throughout this whole thing, there's like flashbacks to not really his origin story, but like kind of his backstory informing the kind of character that Wilson Fisk is.
Right.
I didn't grab any pictures from it, but pretty much like as he's a kid, like I don't know, his father it doesn't explicitly say he was abusive, but it's sort of implied.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he got bullied by kids, but then one day he just decided to just beat up the other kids, and then like
Right.
he stole books from the library, and he was sort of like calculated. And he said the reason why he shaved his head is because there was a lice outbreak, and he just decided to keep himself bald ever since.
Yeah, I thought
And
that was interesting.
yeah, those are kind of the broad strokes of that whole flashback. That kind of goes throughout all the last 3 issues or so. Um, and so Foggy's mom calls the twin killer to the stand, and he's just kind of saying gibberish, so that he can't really do anything to either way. And so because Foggy's witness doesn't show up, the judge dismisses the case. And as Wilson Fisk is driving away, it turns out that Larry was the one driving his limousine. So he shoots him, and he falls off a bridge, seemingly to his death. Um, then Daredevil shows up, and he takes the gun from Larry. And then Matt and Maya meet at the playground, the same playground they fought at earlier, and because this is like an important part of her childhood where her dad used to take her.
Right.
And she basically says that she has something to take care of, and after she's done, they can kind of like start their life together. But obviously, that thing that she um, had to get done was fight Daredevil. And there's a brief moment where Black Widow shows up and they have a conversation, but then Maya shoots a blow dart, a tranquilizer blow dart at Daredevil. He's able to get out of the way, but it hits Natasha. And then so he runs into a dark building, and he's able to apprehend Echo fairly quickly because she can't hear anything, but he's already blind, so the darkness doesn't really affect him that much. And then after the defeat, Maya goes back to the playground, and she kind of is watching all the things that would make sound, and she's trying to think of a way um, to like affect Daredevil the way that the darkness affected her. And she kind of theorizes a different way. The main method is like overwhelm him with sound, but she's also
Mhm.
able to start a fire, and like there's a lot of smoke that affects his scent as well, because that's how he's able to track her in the dark, is he can smell her.
Right.
And then it turns out that obviously Wilson Fisk is not dead, but he's in the sewer. And then the final issue begins with their fight, and it kind of flashes. This issue is primarily Wilson Fisk flashbacks, but the
Mhm.
other part is kind of the fight between the two of them. And it's at this moment where he pins her down. He's able to tell her that like he's actually Matt, because she can see the question mark blood on his cheek. And then he's like, I was in kindergarten when your dad died, so there's no way I could have killed him.
Right.
And she's like, oh, yeah. And then she goes and she shoots Kingpin in the head, and he survives, obviously, like he
What
did
a
in Hawkeye.
surprise. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is the end of this story.
Yeah, I believe in the comics, he was blind for a while
Yeah.
after this. Wilson Fisk was. But yeah, what did you think of this comic story?
I thought it was pretty good. I
Mm-hmm.
haven't read a lot of Daredevil, but I thought
Yeah.
it was pretty good.
Yeah. I had read like half of these before. I had collected like a handful of these issues
Mhm.
before we read this, but it was kind of weird reading them out of context without
Right.
like the full context of the story. But yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting. I think Echo's an interesting character.
Yeah.
I didn't like. Were you familiar at all with Echo before the Hawkeye series?
No.
Okay, I wasn't really. So I was. I think I first heard about. Actually, it's not true. I first knew about her because she was actually the original Ronin in the comics.
Oh, okay.
She was Ronin before Clinton Barton was.
Mhm.
So I kind of knew of like I knew of her name, I guess. But then when the show was like coming out and I saw some set photos, I'm like, Echo, is it like who's that? And I looked more into it, and so I was kind of familiar ish when the show came
Mhm.
out, but then I read some of the comics between, then and when we read this. But
Yeah.
yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting. I think I think the art was interesting. I think like it kind of it kept switching art
Yeah.
styles a lot. I think because both David Ross and Joe Quesada worked on this. I
Hmm.
think I think some of it was a little like odd at times on some panels.
Yeah.
I think that was David Ross's because I think Joe Quesada's is more like lifelike and more like
Mhm.
traditional artsy, I guess, whereas some of David Ross's art was a little bit like cartoonish, like the way, like the
Mhm.
proportions of the bodies
Yeah.
and the faces and stuff. That's kind of what I was talking about. It reminds me a little bit of Humberto Ramos. He's done a lot of Spider-Man
Yeah.
stuff over the years. Reminds me a lot of his art, where it's like,
Mhm.
like they don't look very real. They look almost cartoony or like from a more
Sure.
comedic comic or something. And
Sure.
like I don't hate it, but it takes getting used to. I definitely prefer the more like true to life art style.
Yeah, it was definitely jarring switching
Mm-hmm.
between the two
Yeah.
styles for
And I
sure.
feel like it's a bit like kind of a product of its time. Like it definitely feels like the early 2000s. I
Yes.
feel like a lot of comics were a little like this in the
Mhm.
2000s. Like I feel like every decade kind of had like a specific feel.
Right.
And I
Right.
feel like the early 2000s, late 90s definitely kind of had a lot of art kind of like that.
Mhm.
Um, and I will say, like this is really my only other critique. I feel like there was maybe a little too much like narration. It started to
Yeah.
feel like I was reading a novel, which I love novels, but I feel like for a comic it was a
Mhm.
bit wordy, especially when
Yeah.
it had three
Mm.
different characters
Yeah,
that
I
you were
was
being. Yeah,
gonna say that I switched narration frequently, and it's hard to tell. They were
yeah.
colored, but it was hard to keep track of the colors and who was speaking.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, like with Kingpin, I'm pretty sure his color was pink, but then in one issue it kept switching between pink and green, and I was like, "Is this
Mm.
still Kingpin?" Or yeah, it was a bit
Yeah.
confusing. But I do
Yeah.
think that it worked really well for Echo's character,
Mhm.
because like you kind of get more of like a kind of a look into her thoughts and
Yeah.
like what she's going through when she reveals, when she um has the revelation that revelation that Daredevil killed her dad, all that stuff.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't know. I really like, at least from the issues that we read. I really like the dynamic between Daredevil and Echo.
Yes.
I feel
Yeah,
like they
for
complement each other really well. Like because
sure. Mhm.
she's deaf and he's blind, but I feel like they did a really good job showing like the chemistry between
Mhm.
them. And I kind of wish they did like they. I kind of wish they were more of a item or a team in the comics.
Yeah.
Like like it happens sometimes. Like they definitely team up on again and off again, and there is like a newer series, Daredevil and Echo.
Mhm.
But I feel like his main like love interest slash partner is Elektra,
Right.
and I kind of feel like he and Echo work together better. Well, not like they were fighting, but I feel like if they did team up and all this stuff, which they obviously do in some comics, I just kind of feel like they're almost a better match than him and Elektra. But
Yeah. Yeah.
she more kind of goes off and does her own thing. I feel like she does show up in later Daredevil comics and then like in her own series and stuff like that, but
Mhm.
she isn't as much of a Daredevil character as she is when she first shows up, in the Daredevil comics.
Right.
um but yeah, let's if you had anything else to talk
No,
about
I
the
think we pretty
comic.
much covered it.
Yeah, let's talk about the differences between the comic version of Maya and the MCU version. So she first shows up in Hawkeye.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like on the surface, kind of similar character. She is very much a, she is mentored by Kingpin, but the big difference I feel like from the beginning is that instead of sicking Maya on Daredevil, it's Hawkeye slash Ronin,
Mhm.
who says, but they still kept, the thing where Kingpin was actually the one that killed her father, which
Yeah.
I don't think you really explain in Hawkeye why he did that. Um,
Yeah.
in the comic, there's kind of a throwaway line where he mentions that he like went too far and started acting crazy because his nickname was
Mhm.
Crazy Horse.
Right.
Which, speaking of her father, for some reason in the comic, her dad has a different last name than her. His name is William Lincoln. She's Maya Lopez.
Mhm.
Whereas in the MCU, I'm pretty sure his name is William Lopez. They just
Okay.
kept the same last name. Kind of a minor detail, but I can kind of
Mhm.
see why they kept them having the same last name for sake
Yeah.
of
Right.
just making sense. But yeah, and then obviously at the end of Hawkeye, we see Maya shoot. Well, we don't necessarily see it, but we get the impression that Maya shoots Wilson Fisk in the head, just like in the comic, and he survives just like in the comic because he's in the Echo show. And
Hmm.
we in the show and in that series, he does have like an eye patch on, and it's kind of like it isn't really explained in the series how he's back. Just kind of like in the comic, it's just sort of like, oh well, he just got, he just didn't die. It seems like he has, since he's so influential and wealthy, he has access to some advanced technology.
Hmm.
Because the eye patch thing that he has, like he pulls it off a couple times, and it's kind of got like this blue like laser light thing in it. So I kind of wonder if it isn't some sort of like advanced like Stark Tech type thing.
Hmm.
Um, but yes, but some other differences. Yeah, I think one of the big differences I noticed is that in the comics, Maya can talk. In
Got it.
the shows, in the MCU, she's not able to. I mean, obviously, this was just kind of because the actress Alaqua
Hmm.
Cox, she was also deaf from birth, I believe, and she's not able to talk. In the comics, she had the ability to read people's lips and copy speech basically, but that's obviously not a feasible
Right.
human ability,
Right.
so they just stick to sign language, which I feel like makes sense and probably works better if you're going to have a deaf character
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
screen. I think the weirdest thing to me is that in the comics she's a lip reader, which there are plenty of deaf people that are lip readers, I believe. But for some reason in the MCU, it seems like she kind of reads lips, but not so much. Because in the Echo series, especially, she relies almost solely on sign language when she interacts with people. Like it seems like she's maybe able to read lips a little bit, but
Hmm.
Kingpin doesn't really know sign language that much. It's kind of interesting because in Hawkeye he did use some sign language.
Hmm.
In the Echo show, I don't think he uses sign language at all. He has an interpreter the whole time.
Okay.
He does mention that he learned a little bit because of his niece, but
Hmm.
I don't think he actually ever uses any sort of even like rudimentary sign language like he did in the Hawkeye show, which I found interesting. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, oh yeah, I think okay, but yeah, I said that the lip reading thing and like not speaking was the biggest thing. No, it's actually her powers. So yeah, in the obviously we just talked in the comics she had the ability to basically mimic anything, which is kind of a somewhat common superpower. There are several other
Hmm.
characters in both Marvel, DC, and probably other properties, other things that characters are able to mimic people or things just from watching them. I feel like it's a ability that hasn't really been used very well, especially
Hmm.
not in Marvel. I know, obviously Taskmaster was in Black Widow, but I feel like they didn't really delve very deep into that in the movie. It was just sort of
Right.
like,
Right.
Taskmaster was able to like use different equipment. Was seemed to be like the extent of it. Like, ooh, I have a bow and arrow like Hawkeye. Ooh, I have claws like
Mhm.
Black Panther. Or ooh, I can copy your stance. Like
Right.
they weren't they didn't really. I don't think they really tapped into the kind of the potential of that ability, especially in the comics. Maya's able to play like pretty much any instrument she wants just by watching somebody. It's kind of a very
Mm.
cool ability just for like a normal person to have. I feel like they really could have
Right.
tapped into that, in like an Echo show, but instead, her powers come from like her ancestors, which they kind of spend most of the series kind of building up to that, and I feel like it doesn't have a whole lot of payoff, unfortunately. Um,
Mm.
I will say the series is pretty good, but there are some things like that are kind of like it. There are some like kind of crime elements to it that feel very much kind of like the Daredevil show feels much more like that than any other Disney Plus show. So like
Mhm.
pretty much all the scenes with Kingpin were great. All the scenes they had together, everything like with her past was interesting. But they spent a lot of time in her town with like her family, which wasn't bad. I feel like they just didn't develop any of her family characters that much. So like
Mhm.
I definitely like I liked them, but I didn't care about them that much, even though we spent like most of the season, on there. I feel like maybe they could have used another episode or two to flesh them out more. But
Mhm.
also I feel like they spent a lot of time on her powers, and I feel like the best thing about her powers is that it does more coincide with her character development. um because like the whole point is like she does get her abilities from her ancestors, but it's also kind of like her ancestors are kind of like, I don't know, kind of supporting her from the past, this sort of thing.
Mhm.
And she's also able to kind of have a connection to her mom, because she also her mom died in a car crash where she also lost her leg. And she's kind of, her mom, she gets an ability from her mom, and she's kind of able to like commune with her mom for a minute there because of that like ancestral connection thing. But they never really flesh it out too much, like how that even like happens, besides just sort of a Choctaw legend, I guess. And that's another thing. In the comic, she was Cheyenne. In the
Mhm.
show, she is Choctaw.
Mhm.
And apparently, the reason for that, the director said, let me find it. Yeah, the director, Sydney Freeland, said that she had read the comics, like she read the first appearances, which we just talked
Mhm.
about.
Mhm.
But and she said it was interesting to see this beautifully illustrated literature show her as Cheyenne and Blackfeet. As I developed the series along with my colleagues at Marvel, and we started doing more research, we found that there was a lot of Native American iconography that has been picked because they're cool images, but they're like from a bunch of different tribes and stuff. They're not really,
Yeah.
from one. So they just decided to choose one tribe to kind of base everything off of. And apparently they had some Choctaw writers on staff in the writers' room. So they were
Mhm.
like, I guess we're just going to go Choctaw. So, I mean, I guess that makes sense. I feel like, especially with things like that, I mean, it makes sense to write what
Right.
especially if
Right.
you're trying to, have specific representation. So, that makes sense. Um, but apparently, the biggest reason why they changed her powers, this is according to um, Amy Rardon. She was one of the writers on the series, and she had an interview with Screen Rant, and she said, "I think we talked a lot about deviating from the comics somewhat. I know probably the biggest place is her powers, and we talked a lot about her powers in the room, and ultimately settled on a storyline where her powers were tied to her emotional story and her emotional growth. I think that's a big place where we deviated from the comics, and I think it's not until Maya has that moment with her mother and heals her heart a little bit that she can fully come into her power. Was very much tied into her reconciling her past and moving forward emotionally. So like, I guess like in the course of like a character development, I guess it makes sense, but I feel like it could have been more interesting. Like I kind of wanted to be on board with the power change because I was like it could be cool, but
Yeah.
I feel like they didn't utilize it much.
Mm.
Like her powers are basically, she has like super strength, which she hardly uses, or if she does, they don't really use it much. She has strategy for some reason. That's a power. She has the sharp shooting ability because one of her ancestors was like a in like Western time was a sharpshooter basically, and she has healing from her mom. Her mom had like healing abilities, and I guess her unique ability, she's basically able to give her powers temporarily to other people, um, at least because at some point she gives some of her powers to her family for a brief period of time. But the whole thing, it kind of wraps around the name Echo, that like her ancestors are echoing like through time or something along
Mhm.
those lines. Um, but yeah, another big thing is costume. In the end, her grandmother makes her a costume that I guess is supposed to kind of be like in line with ancestral like Choctaw tradition, I
Mhm.
suppose. Which I guess it. I mean, I'm no expert on Choctaw imagery, but I guess it nails that. But I kind of wish they'd gone more with the like because in the comic she has a very, she's more like ninja esque, I guess,
Yeah.
which really goes in line with Daredevil and everything.
Mhm.
But in this, they really don't do that a lot. She's more of like her fighting style is more like MMA, and she's more of like a gangbanger, if anything, kind of thing, because of her, she's been part of Kingpin's criminal empire. So she hasn't really like done a whole lot of like martial arts stuff besides like boxing, kickboxing, that kind of stuff. And she seems to rely more on guns than like swords or whatever like she does in the comics.
Hmm.
Um, but I do kind of prefer the comic like look of her. Like I kind of like the more like it's sort of like it's kind of like a muted black kind of suit, but I kind of like the black tape wraps on her arms and stuff. And
Mm. Yeah.
probably the closest was like the way she looked at the end of Hawkeye. But even that isn't necessarily like I almost kind of prefer just like the basic like kind of black jacket she
Yeah.
had and stuff. I feel like
Yeah.
that's honestly kind of a cooler look, but you know, I get what they were going for. But it definitely I feel like changes the character a lot from the comics.
Yeah. I mean, I feel so. I think that you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but there's a lot of really interesting and I would say sometimes beautiful iconography associated with different Native American tribes. But
Hmm.
if they wanted to do something more in line with that, I think there's a lot of good options. But what they went with, I
Yeah,
don't think is very good.
yeah, yeah. It's
Um,
yeah.
yeah, it's just not a good suit. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's really bulky. I don't understand.
Yeah.
Like she's supposed to be a very like agile, quick character, but the suit does
Hmm.
not look like. And it looks so weird. There's like some scenes where she has like her gun with her, and it looks
Yeah.
so out of place. Her wearing that suit and holding that gun. I was like, what?
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
just yeah, it's definitely an interesting choice. Like I know why they did that, but I don't think it was probably the best
Yeah.
decision.
Yeah.
But yeah. Oh yeah, but speaking of Daredevil and everything, it was cool to see him for like a couple
Hmm.
minutes in the show. Which
Yeah.
was that was actually the first episode was super good. It
Okay.
kind of like went up and down as the series and progressed, and I don't think they quite stuck the landing. It felt a bit rushed,
Hmm.
but it definitely sets things up more for um, Kingpin in the future. And they definitely left the door open for Maya, but didn't like set anything up. They kind
Hmm.
of gave her a resolution ish. But they're definitely doing more stuff with Kingpin. It's pretty much what you've heard rumored. I'm sure the whole they're like adapting the whole Mayor Fisk
Hmm. Hmm.
thing that's supposed to I think show up in Daredevil Born Again and supposedly in Spider-Man 4 as well.
Hmm.
It seems like he's gonna be like the main bad guy of any street level stuff they do. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything.
Hmm.
I will say she gets. Oh yeah, that's another difference. She's an amputee in the MCU because of the actress,
Right.
whereas she
Right.
wasn't in the comics, and she does actually get a pretty cool. Like her grandpa makes her this new prosthetic leg, and it's actually kind
Mhm.
of cool. Like it's got like this cool like gold bronze like almost armor to it. That's actually pretty cool.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, that's not the best. But so anyway, that is pretty much that's
Yeah.
Daredevil parts of a whole. The first appearance of Echo in the comics, and yeah,
Mhm.
what they've
Mhm.
done with
Mhm.
her in the MCU so far. Now, before we wrap things up, we have our weekly cultured picks. What did you have this week?
Yeah, this week I picked a whole mini series, Green Arrow Year One, and this is the I'd say pretty much the inspiration for the flashbacks in the Arrow TV
Yeah,
show.
I was gonna say this is very reminiscent of Arrow.
Yeah, yeah. Reading it, it's like yeah, you could like this. Pretty much all the elements of the flashbacks are in this book, and
Hmm.
it's really good. It's basically yeah, he's just on the island the whole time. This book is
Yeah.
exclusively that. It ends with him
Oh,
being
okay.
rescued.
Oh, okay.
And like yeah, it's really good. There's like he starts on the island and there's like a China White is there with like the drug cartel and he's kind of fighting that and it's just a really good story and he kind of takes the character back to its roots and I think it's a really good miniseries.
I think in the comics, Oliver is only on the island for like a year, I think, whereas in the show is
Yeah.
5 years.
Hmm.
So like the whole year one makes sense that he was only there
Yes. Yes.
a
Year one.
year. But I actually had two comics this week. The first one is Avengers Twilight that just came out a couple days ago. I really didn't know what the hell this was going to be. I just knew like the Alex Ross art looked pretty cool. and I was curious what it was. It's just going to be a mini series, but I read it and it's basically like Dark Knight Returns, but with Steve Rogers.
Oh, okay.
Well, like it definitely pulls elements from that. It pulls elements from like kind of reminds me a bit of some V for Vendetta stuff, like with what's going on with like the government and everything. But like pretty much everybody's old. Captain America doesn't have his super soldier serum anymore. But there's like this kind of secret. I mean, I don't know how secret it is, but there's basically a fascist government that's running everything, but they're kind of pretending like everything's the same as it always was. So nobody really, nobody who's not paying attention really thinks they're being oppressed necessarily. And like Shield is basically like the enforcers of the government, and there's like like a nightly curfew that you'll basically be arrested and assaulted if you don't if you aren't home. And because like there's this big event that happened where the villains got the upper hand and killed a bunch of people, including a bunch of the Avengers, and that kind of seemed to end a lot of the super heroics. But by the end of it, there's like this resistance being partially led by Luke Cage, and Cap joins them because they kind of need him to be like the face of their uprising. But yeah, there was this interesting part where Luke Cage basically can't move, and I thought it was because he was just old, which is that is part of it. But apparently, as he got older, his indestructible skin like stopped moving, so he's basically just like kind of like partially frozen, so he can't really walk and stuff. It's kind of interesting. But the other comic I wanted to mention also came out pretty recently is the new Ultimate Spider-Man, and this is basically relaunching the Ultimate Universe. This kind of comes after the Ultimate Invasion story arc that came out, where basically Ultimate Reed Richards, aka the Maker, goes back in time on this one Earth and just stops all heroes from being, well, at least as many heroes as he can from becoming who they're supposed to be, including Peter Parker. So Peter Parker grows up and lives his life with Mary Jane, and they have kids, but he kind of always has this feeling that he's meant for something else. And it's very interesting. I really liked. It's similar enough to the Marvel universe where you're like, oh, I recognize that. I recognize this, But I feel like it's a very interesting take that we haven't quite seen before. And it really sets up a lot of interesting stuff. Just kind of having, like, not that Peter Parker just, got his powers later in life, but he was supposed to always be Spider-Man, and that got taken away from, like, time travel stuff. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, I really enjoyed that book. But that is our cultured picks for the week, and that ends our episode. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Be sure to like and subscribe and share. If you would like to support us on Patreon, you can find us on patreon.com/theculturednerd and look for our show specific tier if you'd like to support this show. Thank you to all of our current Patreon supporters: Wesley H., Mitch S., Connor Y., Anna M., Oscar B., Craig L., and Salib K. Our logo was designed by Jose Navarro, and our intro was designed by myself. Once again, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to check out The Cultured Nerd on social media, you can scan the QR code on the bottom left. If you would like to check out Casual Experts, which is me and Luke's other brand, we've got our whole YouTube channel, another podcast, socials, all that stuff. You can scan the QR code on the bottom right.